to start? I can start. All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. It's so good to see. Hello. It's good to see all your faces here, and everybody seems really happy and excited to be here. And how are you guys doing tonight? Great. Welcome to Congregation Mayim Chaim, the Messianic Synagogue of the Eastern Shore. I'm Rabbi Toby Manolis, the assistant rabbi here with Senior Rabbi David Tokager, who is partnering with me this week. David is not supposed to be here. I'll let him explain that if he wants to, why he is here. But was very happy to find that I wouldn't be doing this by myself. I'd have David here. This is we talked about what we were doing this week, and we're talking about Passover. We're going into Passover next week, and you're here because we wanted to give essentially a teaching on, what we do. And if you already know Passover, well, listen, God said every year, remind yourself. So, whether you need to be reminded or you're learning, I just want you to know you have a very unique representation in front of you. You have two people that you have David as a native-born Messianic Jew who was raised Jewish his whole life. And you have me, who is kind of like the outsider, who am not Jewish and not Jewish biologically, and was raised in the church and saw these things and crossed over into them, right? So, and interestingly enough, Scripture actually talks about both those people. God says, of course, he gives the command to Israel to celebrate the Passover, but then he says, if an outsider who's not Jewish wants to come and do this, let him in. Right? So you have this representation in front of you as both the native-born and the outsider, one in Messiah, right? And so welcome. And David, do you have anything? You're here. And
Yeah, I'm here. I was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be in Israel, but if you tracked anything that's happened in the past few days, Israel was attacked by Iran for the first time in history, was attacked by Iran from Iranian soil. And by the way, when I say the first time in history, the last time that the people who reside in Iran messed with the Jewish people, we were in a diaspora, and a significant portion of us were stuck in the Persian Empire. The Iranians are actually Persians. When the IRGC took over in the 70s, when the IRGC took over in the 70s, they changed the name to Iran, but it's actually Persia. And so they attacked Israel. They launched several waves of UAVs, unmanned aircraft, what they called one-way suicide attack drones. They launched a ton of rockets and some cruise missiles. The rockets primarily all came from Hezbollah, so they were shot out of Lebanon, out of Syria. The Houthis were firing out of Yemen and so on. And then the Iranians were actually launching UAVs and cruise missiles from Iran. So it was a bit of a mess. All of this was happening. We were supposed to fly out of Pensacola to Miami at 6:20 a.m. Sunday morning, and then out of Miami to Israel at 2 p.m. or 2-ish on Sunday afternoon, and all of this was happening overnight here on Saturday. And so we ended up canceling our trip at the very last minute. It was like Saturday night, about 9 o'clock or so, canceled our trip out of precaution, because even though it looked like Iran was done with what they were doing and said that, we can now consider this concluded, we weren't sure when Israel would respond and what that response would look like, and then the volley of quote-unquote responses it would present from there. And so we opted to cancel the trip out of precaution. And then a few hours later, Israel reopens Ben Gurion in Tel Aviv, and all flights were back to normal. Our biggest concern were two things. One is we didn't want to get to Miami and find out we didn't have a flight to Israel. and then have to figure it back out coming back again. The other thing was we didn't want to get to Israel and either be stuck in our hotel room / some sort of bunker for the entire time we were there and not be able to do what we were going there for, or to be stuck there for an extended period of time, longer than we were anticipating. So we will be rescheduling the trip. As an aside, all of the funds that have been given have all been or are all being at the moment sent to people in Israel, so it's still going there, even though we're not physically there. We just aren't at the moment able to physically put it in their hands personally, but it's still getting in their hands. So I think all in all, it was close to 16 grand between Bradam and CMC that was raised. So it'll be a tremendous blessing to a lot of people in Israel. So with that said, obviously keep Israel in prayer, because things are only going to get a little more difficult from here. Pray for resolve, pray for safety, pray for protection. With all of the rockets and UAVs and everything that Iran and their proxies launched at one time towards Israel, Israel defended against 99% of them. So 99% hit nothing in Israel. And by Israel defended it, Israel, but also allies, the U.S., shot down a bunch of them. France, England, Jordan, all shot down a bunch of them. And then to make things even more interesting, there are theories that part of what Iran was trying to do was ruin stabilization of relationship between Saudi and Israel. And then it comes out that Saudi actually was leaking intel to America and Israel about what was happening, or what was going to happen. And then there's some intel. I saw some stuff from the New York or the Jerusalem Post and a few others that apparently Iran reached out to America, to our current administration. I won't mention names, but to our current administration, basically said, how far can we take this retaliation before you let your dogs off the leash, is the general interpretation of it. And the president gave them parameters of how far they could take their attack. And this was long before Israel ever knew that this was happening. So Israel had 10 hours of notice. This was before that they reached out through proxy communication, because Iran and America don't actually talk technically, except through other people. And so it appears that we were very sketchily involved in this whole scenario, and had Israel not defended against 99% of them, this could have been a very, very complicated situation, more so than we could imagine. So with that said, I am here, and Rabbi Toby's not on the hook by himself anymore. And so he's going to be primarily leading, and I'll be jumping in here and there as we go through. So I shall hand back off to you. Do you want to open some prayer?
Yeah. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for this glorious season of Passover, Lord. And I just pray, Father, that the words that me and David speak will be breathed from by you, Lord, and to be received by your children, Father, today. Just ask that everything that comes forth from the bema today will be from you, Lord. And we just want to, for the sole purpose of giving you glory and honor, in Yeshua's name, amen. All right. So yeah, take some notes. If you got it, if you got stuff for that, because we're going to be making some connections and stuff. I kind of broke this up into, I used to be a history teacher, so, and I still am a little bit, because the Bible's a lot of history, right? So, and generally the way I would approach things with my students is I would say, anytime you look at something historical, you have to know who, what, where, when, why, and how. Those are the 6 things. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. The who's going to be pretty easy tonight. It's going to be the quickest thing we talk about. The who is God and his people. That's it. That's the who involved in Passover, God and his people, right? So that's the who. I want to talk about when, though, first. When. And before what I'm going to do is I'm going to read part of Exodus 12, and then we're going to go back and kind of work through it with the Passover, right? So let's start with when, but let's read this right here. And I'm going to start with Exodus chapter 12, verse 1. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. We're at Exodus 12. Interestingly, I just want to say this is the first interesting thing I want you to notice. The Passover was instructed by God before there was even a Torah. Before God gave the Torah, he instructed regarding the Passover. That makes it very important, right? So here it goes, beginning in verse 1, Exodus chapter 12. Now Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month will mark the beginning of months for you." We're coming up on that day. We're coming up on we're coming up on that day. We're coming up on that. This month will mark the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year for you. It's not January. We're going to talk about that. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one lamb for the household. If the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor are to take one according to the number of people. According to each person eating, you are to make your count for the lamb. Your lamb is to be without blemish, a year-old male. You must take it from the sheep or from the goats. You must watch over it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to slaughter it at twilight. They are to take the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the crossbeam of the houses where they will eat it. They are to eat the meat at night, roasted over a fire, with matzot, that's unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. They are to eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled with water, but only roasted with fire, its head and its legs and innards. So let nothing of it remain until morning. Whatever remains until the morning, you are to burn with fire. Also, you are to eat it in this way. With your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is Adonai's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt. I am Adonai. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. Passover. I will pass over you. So there will be no plague among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day is to be a memorial for you. You are to keep it as a feast to Adonai. Throughout your generations, you are to keep it as an eternal ordinance. God expects here we are today, the Passover. That this is what pulled me into Messianic Judaism, is I can live this. Today, you're living it. We're remembering the Passover. So here's the thing, the when. The when. Because if you're a Messianic believer, you're not only taking on, because here's the thing with the church. They just deal with January through December, like the rest of the world. You come into this building, you have another calendar you got to deal with. The original calendar that God prescribed. He didn't say, hey, January is the first month, guys. That came along in Rome. That's why it's called Gregorian. It's the Roman calendar. It is not a biblical calendar. This calendar, God says, first month of the year, Nisan, first month. He said, that is the first month of the year. If you notice, and David will probably talk a little bit about this, we have 3 New Years that we talk about mainly. There's this period of time where God says, this is your first month, Nisan, starts in the spring, which I think is kind of interesting that God says, for God, the year begins when everything's blooming and in the spring and everything's green and everything's new and the earth's renewing itself versus January 1st when everything's still dead, right? But so you have this, what God says in Exodus 12. Nisan 1, this is the first of months for you. The second one is what? When do we say Happy New Year again? Rosh Hashanah. That's the first of Tishrei. That's in the fall. What the heck is that for, right? That's a different kind of New Year. But it's still considered a New Year traditionally in Judaism. And then you have January 1st, which is like the Gregorian New Year. So it's kind of like, it's important, though, to know what these mean and why we do them. The first of Nisan was the first year according to God, and what's significant, and that it's significant compared to Rosh Hashanah. If somebody asks you what the New Year is, you kind of have to say, well, which one, right? And Passover begins about 2 weeks into the first month. So God says, first month, Nisan 1. Boop. 2 weeks in, Passover. It's the first one, right? So Dave, you want to talk about the different New Years?
So, yeah, you actually have several New Years in Judaism. Nisan 1, the first of Nisan, which you'll also see biblically as Aviv, the first of Aviv. Nisan 1 is the biblical prescribed new year. God said this is the day that you begin your year and begin counting. Rosh Hashanah, which is Rabbi Toby said earlier, is actually Yom Teruah scripturally. Yom Teruah is the Feast of Trumpets, or of more accurately, like sounding a great noise, like yelling. So Rosh Hashanah is the Feast of Trumpets, where we're commanded to blow the shofar. But in modern Judaism, we also consider it a new year. It's when the year number changes. So 5784 we're in right now. It'll jump to 5785 with the next year, and so on. So it's when the year number changes. It's also viewed as having a royal new year to it, so it's connected to the appointment of kings and so on. And then you have Tu B'Shavat, which is the new year of trees, and a few other things like that kind of sprinkle around. Now, this may seem abnormal to most Western minds, except it really is what we live with on a regular basis anyways, right? Because we have January 1st, which is New Year. You have the fiscal New Year, which is, much later in the year. You have the New Year, school New Year, which usually starts in August. Now, when we were younger, it was like September. Now it's in August, and it's getting earlier. I think it's like second week of August this year, first week, something stupid like that. And so on. So you've got a bunch of different New Years that roam around in the Western mindset. So it's not as abnormal as we like to think it is, but the actual first of Nisan is the official biblical New Year. Like, that is what God commanded. This is the beginning of the year. And that's important because God tells us that the biblical calendar, particularly the Moedim that we read in Leviticus 23, are there as signs and times. They're connected. It's all a lunar calendar, so it's connected with the sun, the moon, the stars, particularly the moon. We're supposed to look at the sun and the moon and the stars as signs and times of the seasons. The biblical calendar, it moves with the moon, so we're following the moon for those signs and times of the seasons. So it's really important, and they're all prophetic. All of the Moedim, all of the biblical appointed days are all prophetic, and so they're deeply connected to the first coming of Mashiach with Pesach and first fruits, and Shavuot, or what most believers know as Pentecost, are deeply connected to the first coming of Messiah, with Yeshua as our Passover lamb, as lost my train of thought there. The first fruits, there we go, first fruits of the resurrection. And then the Shavuot, or what we know as Pentecost, most of the believers know as Pentecost. Shavuot is the fulfillment of the outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh, which mirrors what we read in Exodus 19 and 20, which occurs on Shavuot. And then the spring feasts are the fall feasts we're still awaiting for. So the spring feasts deal with the first coming of Mashiach, and the fall feasts deal with his second coming. And so they are prophetically tied to his second coming. So watching the signs and times of the season, the sun, moon, stars in the sky, and so on, and their connectivity to the biblical calendar is vitally important. And so many believers just simply write it all off. And it doesn't matter, right? And we're trying to understand end-time prophecy, but we're missing out on major components and pieces to understanding end-time prophecy.
Yeah. Okay, so the when is right around now, spring. And we just wanted to kind of share with you guys that it's so important to understand when God says this month, this month, this month. Because understand, there were 70 people that went into Egypt. Now millions are coming out. So God is going to give them a Torah to create a community, systems, orders, laws. So now he's saying, and the first thing he tells them is, you need a calendar.
Yep.
So here's the thing.
And particularly, last Monday night and Tuesday was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So the beginning of the new moon of Nisan, the beginning of Nisan. And then we have the 14th of Nisan coming around this Sunday night, Monday, and the 15th of Nisan, which is the High Shabbat, first High Shabbat of Pesach or Passover, is Monday night, Tuesday, the 22nd, 23rd. Sorry, continue.
No, good. So I want to move into, so we got the when, I want to move into the why. Why do we do certain things on Passover? And we're going to talk about three main things. There's three main things you do during Passover. You remove the leaven from your home. Then the chametz, which you'll hear that a lot tonight, chametz. You remove the chametz, or anything with yeast or leaven or rising agents, from your home. The second thing is you abstain from eating those things. during the Feast of Unleavened Bread for those 7 days. And the third thing you do is you hold or you attend a Seder, which is where you hear the story. So you're honoring what God says is, remember, 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 right? And before we go into those things, I'm going to give you a Hebrew word that I want you guys to remember. It's a Hebrew phrase. It's called kal vahomer. It's I guess if you want to spell it in English, the way it sounds, it would be Q-A-L and then V-A-H-O-M-E-R, kal vahomer. It means light to heavy. That is something in Jewish thought. When they think of the things of God, in many ways, the way Scripture teaches things, it's from a light to heavy. Yeshua did it all the time. Let me give you an example. Do you remember the Scripture? I don't know the exact reference, but when Yeshua says, how many of you parents who love your kids, if your kid asks for a piece of bread, you give them a stone? What is Yeshua really trying to say? What's he trying to explain? He goes, you parents who can be sinful, love your kids. What's he saying? If you guys feel that way, how much more does your Heavenly Father? The light is me, a sinful man. When my son asks me for chips, I don't give him a bag of rocks. That's the light. So God says, if that, you who are light compared to me, God is heavy. Kavod, even the word glory means heaviness. God says, I'm the heavy. If you who are light love your kids, I who am heavy, you're not going to outlove me. If you can forgive each other, how much more do I forgive, right? I want you to think of that when you're thinking about removing chametz, because the light is removing the chametz. The heavy is removing sin, right? God is and the Torah we know is always pointing to something greater. The light compared to the Messiah is the Torah. The heavy is Yeshua, who's the substance of those things, right? He's the embodiment of what the Passover is doing. So removing chametz, abstaining from eating those things for 7 days, and attending a Seder. Okay? And you wanted to talk about 1 Corinthians 5. And,
Yeah, before we do, though, I want to add in, there is one fourth thing that's vitally important, because the removing chametz and avoiding eating chametz means nothing if you're not doing the other part, which is that we're also commanded to eat matzah. We are commanded for 7 days to eat matzah. So it's not just hey, we throw this on the Seder because, we got to get it out of the way somewhere, so we'll eat a little bit of it first night and never touch it again. We're actually commanded to eat it throughout. Why? What's it called? And we talk about this every year in our Passover Seder. What's another thing that we call matzah? The bread of affliction, right? And so it's connected to the affliction of Israel in Egypt. It's connected to the affliction of Mashiach on the cross, and so on. And so we're commanded to participate. Remember, the whole reason we celebrate Passover is to imagine ourselves being a part of Israel when God freed us from Egypt, right? So it's important that we add that extra thing. We are commanded to eat matzah, which is probably the worst part of it all, because matzah generally is terrible. Although the gluten-free matzah is not bad, but matzah in general just doesn't taste great. It's like
you got to be creative.
It's eating crunchy cardboard.
You can make good lasagna with it.
Yeah, I live off of matzah pizzas during Pesach, but.
You do the lasagna, you can do lasagna, and I do peanut butter and jelly, but it falls apart. You can do pizza.
Butter on matzah is really good.
So you got to be creative.
All right. So when we're talking about removing the chametz, removing the leavening from our home, it's really important that we understand this concept, because it's not just there's a loaf of bread, let me go get rid of the loaf of bread. It's way more than that. You would be painfully surprised at how much crap is in our houses that have chametz in it. Right? Because we're talking about chametz, but it's not just yeast. It's any rising agent. Yeast, if you're looking at an ingredients list on a package, it's yeast, yeast extract, anything that just says leavening. If it's got baking soda, baking powder, which, by the way, if you go to get the kosher for Passover, Manischewitz kosher for Passover cakes or cookies or whatever, they're actually, by Orthodox standards, sure, because they look at baking soda as being a synthetic leavening agent rather than being actually yeast-based or what have you, but it's a leavening agent. And so, scripturally speaking, anything that causes it to rise, we're not supposed to eat. So, though by Orthodox halakha, the Manischewitz and whatever kosher for Passover baked goods are safe by scriptural definition, it's not. because any rising agent, right? But then you got to go farther than that. You're not just looking at bread and bagels and all this kind of stuff that may be in your house. You've got to go look through your seasoning cabinet, because all of your seasonings, a significant portion of them are going to have some version of one of those in it. You got to look for sodium bicarbonate, which is the fancy way of saying baking soda. You'll see that sometimes. If you go to your bathroom and look at your toothpaste, a lot of toothpaste has baking soda in it. You'd have to get rid of that. You go to your freezer. If you've got like frozen meats and things like that or whatever, anything in your freezer, you got to look to see what's inside of it. And if you don't have a label on it anymore, like if you toss it in a Ziploc bag and you're not really sure, it's always better to be safe than sorry. You toss it out, right? Now, Passover is likely where the concept of spring cleaning probably came from, because you actually start in early Nisan, towards the beginning of Nisan, you begin to prep your home. You begin going through your cabinets, going through your pantry, going through your refrigerator, going through everything, looking at all the ingredients and anything that may have chametz in it, you remove it. Traditionally, in modern Judaism, you would then take all of that, put it in a box or a couple of boxes, and bring it to your neighbor who's not Jewish, and you would sell it to them for a small amount of money, and they would keep it somewhere in their house and stash it. And then you would go back after Pesach, because, you know, I'm going to say that there are certain stereotypes that are not just stereotypes. We paid for that good food. We don't really want to waste the money we spent on that good food. We can be cheap and frugal at times. And so you'll then go back to your neighbor after Passover, and you'll redeem it. You'll buy that box of chametz back, bring it back so you can get your money's worth out of it, right? But when we look at 1 Corinthians 5, I think 1 Corinthians 5 puts this all in perspective, right? Because as I said, Passover points to the first coming Mashiach, particularly the death, burial, resurrection of Yeshua as our sacrifice lamb. But 1 Corinthians 5 goes through this whole description of removing chametz from our life, right? And so it begins with verse 6. Your boasting is no good. Don't you know that a little chametz leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old chametz so you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened for Messiah. Our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with old chametz, the chametz of malice and wickedness, but with unleavened bread, the matzah of sincerity and truth. And we see scripturally numerous times that there's this kind of imagery connection, this symbolic connection between chametz or leavening and sin. And so the whole reason we're searching through our house to remove chametz, we're also supposed to be searching our hearts, like seeking the Lord to remove the chametz, the sin of our lives, out of our hearts. Now, the problem for me with putting our chametz in our neighbor's house, first off, I always think it's really interesting that we Jewish people will then hand it off to our Gentile neighbors. Like, look, this chametz, this sin, not good enough for me this week. Yeah, it's okay for you.
I'm obeying God. You don't have to.
It's like it's okay for you because God doesn't really care about you anyways. No. And then afterwards, you're like, okay, I can have it again, right? That's just problematic to me. The idea that, you know, if it's sin, if it's representative of sin, and it's not good enough for me, why would it be good for anyone else, right? Amen. And Isaiah calls us to be a light to the nations. So why would it be good for anyone else? The other side of it is, if that chametz that we've gone out of all of this hard effort to search, and I mean hard, like traditionally you would not just search through your cabinets, but you're like flipping your couch cushions and vacuuming in the crevices, and you're going through your oven, and not just self-cleaning, but you're like deep cleaning inside of the oven and clearing stuff out. You're going through your sink. You're rewashing all of your dishes, lest there might be a little bit on it somewhere. All of your pots and pans and so on. You're going through everything. And a lot of regards, you'll go through cars and all this kind of stuff, because you're going to be in your car a lot. Heck, half of us probably live in our cars half the time because of driving back and forth to work and whatever else. You're going to be going through your cars. You're going to be digging through everything, cleaning everything up. And then in a lot of Orthodox communities, they'll actually line their countertops and their tables with aluminum foil for the entire week of Passover, so that their non-leavened food, so that their kosher for Passover food doesn't touch the counter that they've already cleaned, but might still have remnants of chametz somewhere on it. So they'll cover it all with aluminum foil so that it doesn't get messed up. And then a lot of times will actually have a cabinet set aside specifically for kosher Passover foods, and they'll lock all the rest of their cabinets in case there might be something that was missed. They don't go into it and accidentally take it out or whatever. So there's a real intentionality that goes through it. And that sounds really ridiculous at times. It sounds hyper-religious. It might sound like it's legalistic. But the reality is that depth that it takes to search for the chametz, to remove it from our lives, and it doesn't matter whether or not we think it sounds hyper-religious or whatever, the Bible tells us to do it. So we do it, right? And it's hard to look at God and go, look, you're being a little pushy here. This is kind of ridiculous. This is legalistic. And God's going, it's not legalistic if I told you to do it, right? That's not where, if you're doing it because you think it matters in terms of your eternity, that's a problem, yes. But I told you to do this. There's not a problem with that. But it's a foreshadowing of the reality of the Messiah removing sin from our lives, in which there is this deep introspective process that we go through, allowing the Ruach to search through our lives, just as we search for the chametz through our home to remove it from us. And what's really interesting to me, and this has been my experience my entire life, is it almost never fails that you'll get 2, 3, 4 days into Passover, and you'll open a cabinet that you know you dug through, like you removed you open that cabinet up and you'll look at it, and magically there's a package of goldfish or a box of cookies that somehow you overlooked. Right? And then you're like, well, we're this far into Passover, I'll go throw them away for now, and I'll have to ask for forgiveness that it was here and whatever. But that's important to grasp. That fact that we can't be perfect is important, right? Because when we think we've done all the work and gotten rid of all of the mess is when we become lazy in our walk with our faith, right? And so it's a reminder that even when we think everything's been rid, we're not in the Olam Haba yet, so there's still more stuff for the Lord to work out in our life. And it's a reminder that even when we think we've done the best, there's a chance that we might have missed something, right? And so it's important, this link between the chametz of Pesach and removing it and what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 5, and we see this imagery in other places of chametz representing sin. And so why would we want to hand our sin off to our neighbors so that it's not in our life, but then after Passover go back and go, hey, you know all that sin that God freed me from, I want it back. Let me take that back, and here's what you gave me for it. I'm going to give it back to you so I can have all of that sin back in my life, right? So in our household, and what we always encourage people to do is gather up all the chametz out of your house, and then right before Pesach, throw it away. Just get rid of it. Don't bring, you're going to go out and buy more after Passover, right? But don't bring the symbolism of the old man back into your life again. We try really hard not to walk in the nature of the old man as it is, right? So symbolically, it's important to see that connection in our discipleship.
Yeah, so, and like what Rabbi David's saying is that the frozen pizza that you have to take out of the freezer and throw away, the frozen pizza in itself is not sin. It is symbolically. You're doing the light. The light is the frozen pizza. The heavy is the actual sin in your heart.
Not gonna lie, if you look like me, maybe that frozen pizza is sin, but
keeping that in mind, so one of the first things we do is we go through our homes and we start to remove the leaven to prepare our home, clean our home, and those kinds of things, and it is a wonderful time not to do if anything you do for God becomes a chore, but when you're doing it, understanding, and I think a wonderful thing to do, and this is just me, make it something enjoyable. Put on some worship music, but make it something. Pray while you do it. While you're throwing the leaven away, ask God to bring anything up in your life that you need to remove. So make it something meaningful with God. The issue isn't God making himself available to us. We often don't go to him and say, I want to be available for you. God's like, I don't have an issue. 24/7, I am here. You guys, though, are... So if you give God room, he will fill that room. That's how he is. He's loving, and he takes the initiative. Keeping our mind on the light to the heavy, though, still, I want to move on into another very important part of Passover, which is the Passover lamb. Now, you don't have to eat lamb for Passover, but it is traditionally something that many people do eat during Passover. But why? Okay, here's my thing. Who is our Passover lamb? Yeshua is our Passover lamb. Why is Yeshua our Passover lamb and not our Yom Kippur goat or our Yom Kippur bull? Right? This is also important for you to understand because you're not just celebrating what God did for the children of Israel in Egypt. You're celebrating God, your exodus from sin. You left Egypt in a symbolic way. You left the world to be, so God could be your God, right? You're celebrating that, right? The Passover lamb is important too because we just read in Exodus 12 that there is a lamb, not just a big, annoying lamb. These little, go to YouTube and look up a baby lamb. Here's the problem. Let me imagine, let me put myself in their shoes. If you have little children, my daughter is 7 and my son who is 9, who are constantly bothering me about getting a dog because they want a little animal to love on, right? If I brought a lamb, and you had to keep that lamb, it says you have to watch over this lamb for several days. Now, you try to do that with little babies and then tell them, hey, guys, yes. Mm-hmm. The cost of sin is in the Passover. That is powerful to me. That lamb becomes a pet. It becomes a pet. The lamb does. And I think of, that's the light. That's just the light. The heavy is Yeshua came and said, I'm not always going to be here. One day. And the disciples were crazy about it. Nothing's going to happen to you, Peter. That's not going to happen to you. Nuh-uh. Yeshua's like, yeah. So when you think about the cost of sin in the Passover, and you think about, man, I can't imagine it started off a very happy Passover if you had little babies and you're watching over this little lamb. And then God goes, one day, I'm going to have to do that. One day, I'm going to have to offer up my lamb. That is why when John saw Yeshua, he said, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. That's why the lamb. That's why the blood. Because blood has to be shed for a holy God to connect with sinful man, if there's a cost. So that's why the blood. The blood on the lintels, you don't physically take the lamb's blood, right, and do that on Passover. No. But you applied the blood of Yeshua on your heart, right? What's also interesting, a difference between Passover and Yom Kippur, why Yeshua isn't called our Yom Kippur. Now, Yeshua fits into our great high priest, according to Hebrews, but he is our Passover lamb. Why? I want you to notice the difference between Yom Kippur and Passover. And you may already know this difference. The difference is, for Yom Kippur, once a year, the high priest went into the tent and made atonement for the whole nation. One man did it, right? So the children of Israel, they were still in their tents. The high priest had to do this. In the Passover, what does it say? You, your household, your household, your household, your household. It was individual. It was individual. The Passover is about your individual atonement, your individual redemption. Listen, God showed up, but you chose to follow. God came up to you and said, can I have this dance, honey? And you went, yeah. Not everybody does that. Not everybody does that. Yeshua died for the world, but does the whole world accept? No. So the Passover is you celebrating, I made a choice. He was going to be my God, right? Did you have anything to add about the Yom Kippur?
When you're looking at the idea, which Rabbi Toby hit pretty well. When you're looking at the idea of the Passover lamb, not only was it personal versus Yom Kippur being national, but aside from that, what was the point to Yeshua's sacrifice? It was to redeem us from the punishment of sin, which the punishment of sin is death, eternal death, right? So the lamb that was slain in the Exodus was placed upon the doorpost of Israel so that the death angel would pass over them. And in the same sense, Yeshua became our Passover lamb so that eternal death would pass over us. Why? Because his blood was put upon our heart. So there's a very important connection tied in there that helps us understand the deeper reality of what's going on in the not only the narrative of the Passover in Exodus And it's multiple recitations of the command to observe it in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy and other places. But we also see that connection come back around with the reality of Yeshua as that Messiah. And thing to understand, when he talks about that lamb becoming a pet, you take that lamb into your household, you go out to your flock, you find the most prime specimen of lamb that's available, like perfect, spotless, not even a damaged follicle. Like, you've got to really inspect this thing. You bring it into your house on the 10th of Nisan. So it's during the day on the 10th of Nisan, so you're already halfway into the day. You bring it into your house on the 10th of Nisan. You spend the next 3.5 days with that lamb in your household, as treated as a pet, as a part of the family, etc. And then while you're going through that, the entire time you're constantly inspecting the lamb to make sure it hasn't gotten hurt or got caught on something that cut it or damaged it in some way or has anything askew, because it has to be perfect, spotless lamb. And then on the 14th of Nisan, you then go and slaughter that lamb as the sacrifice for your family. So you take something that has now become very dear. If you've ever taken an animal into your home for any reason, it's part of your family almost instantaneously, right? When we jokingly, our dogs will annoy the crap out of us. And jokingly we'll go, I'm ready to get rid of them all. And my kids will just start to lose their mind, because that's family. That's part of their life. Like, you can't do, and we're just joking, saying, and they know that, but it still will wreck them at that idea, right? So your kids have to watch you slaughter this lamb that they got super close with. And then they've got to eat it, right? And then we see that Yeshua, right? Yeshua ends up spending 3.5 years walking with the disciples in relationship, becoming very intimate and close in their lives, while the entire nation of Israel inspected him constantly for 3.5 years. Those questions, the tricky questions they were asking him, it wasn't just them trying to trap him like we often read the gospel narrative, but it was actually the nation of Israel that was, whether they realized it or not, that was inspecting this spotless lamb before he would die for their sins, before he becomes their Passover lamb, right? So it goes so much deeper. We look at things on that surface level, and honestly, most believers look at that account with zero understanding to the actual Jewish heritage of what's happening there, because most of the body of Messiah has divorced itself from its own Jewish heritage, right? The body of Messiah, the church as we know it, came from first century Judaism. Now, it was 2 centuries later when it became something other, but it comes from first century Judaism. And so the fact that the church has divorced itself from its Jewish heritage, its Jewish roots, when we talk about Easter in the church, when we talk about what they call the Holy Week, from Palm Sunday to Good Friday to Easter — by the way, Good Friday to Easter Sunday doesn't mathematically work on the 3-day, 3-night thing, in case you're wondering. It doesn't. But aside from that, when we talk about that imagery of the Holy Week, they don't understand that there was something far deeper happening there, that these Jewish disciples that walked with him understood, that the nation of Israel as a whole were probably starting to piece things together and grasp. That's why after his resurrection, there were hundreds of people that came to faith. There were 500 people that saw him, at least, that saw him in his resurrected form. By the end of Acts 2, there were thousands of Jewish people that had come to faith. By the time we get to Acts 10, which is anywhere from 15 to 25 years after Acts 2, by the time we get to Acts 10, where Cornelius' house experienced the Spirit of God fall upon them, by the time we get there, there's likely millions of Jewish people that have come to faith in Yeshua already. Yeshua had for lack of a better way of wording this, a butt ton, which is a real unit of measurement, a butt ton of Jewish people that followed him while he was alive and well and ministering. How do we know that? Because it tells us that a ton of people walked away when he died. A ton of people walked away at one point when he answered something that was a little more than they were willing to accept. And then more of them walked away when he died, because they thought, all of this was for nothing. His own disciples, after he died, went, well, that was a fun ride. What do we do now? Oh, I know. Let's go back to the old man. Very literally, they went back fishing, which is where he called most of them from. They all packed up. Well, that was a fun ride. Let's, I guess, go back to the old man. Let's go back to work. And where is it that Yeshua meets them again? At the old man. And what does he do? He calls them back from that again, right? So it's really important when we see that there is so much more in the imagery and the symbolism of Passover as a whole than most people really grasp and understand. And it breaks my heart that most of the body of Messiah wants nothing to do with it. And it's not that they actively want nothing to do with it. They just don't know, right? And if you don't know something, you're not going to go chase after it. But so many Gentiles come into the Messianic Jewish movement because they're reading their Bible and they go, oh, something seems interesting about this Shabbat thing. Maybe it's still important. Oh, this Passover thing, it does say eternal. Maybe there's something to that. As an aside, I said this at a church that we did a Seder for right before Easter. If you don't believe that God's eternal covenant with Israel, that Israel, the Jewish people, would be his chosen people eternally, if you don't believe that his covenant, his eternal covenant with Israel is actually eternal, if you believe that somehow at the cross God cut the Jewish people off and replaced them with the church, the Gentile church, if you believe that, then you can't possibly legitimately believe that your salvation can be eternal. Because if you believe that when God says something is eternal in the Tanakh, but he can flip the switch on it, then what makes you think he won't flip the switch on your salvation being eternal? In order for us to truly believe that our salvation in the blood of our Passover lamb is eternal, we have to accept that God's promises and covenant relationship with Israel is equally eternal. Otherwise, we can't believe either. It's not either or, it's both or neither. That's the only option.
No, yeah, absolutely. And so we're going on with about a little over 10 minutes or so left. So I wanted to open it up because we're going to end by going just through some practical things that you can do, because we're going to talk about the Seder last. We're not going to go through the whole Seder. We're just going to talk about some resources and some options and things like that. And because I think the number one reason that why people don't do Shabbat dinner is because they feel like, well, what do? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I'm not ready. I don't have Judaica. Some people, because they don't have Judaica, they won't even do the holidays. So we want to talk about that. You don't need Judaica. Judaica is beautiful, and I would recommend Judaica, but you don't have to have Judaica to do the Passover or the Shabbat or any of those things. So, but before we get to that, we've talked about a lot of the symbolism and things like that and why Passover is important. And does anybody have any questions or comments before we move to this part about where we talk a little bit about the Seder and stuff? Yes.
Yeah, Danielle's got the microphone. This way everybody can hear.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have one problem. I have got to the point that I just think, give me a little piece of bread. Mm-hmm. I don't eat bread. Mm-hmm. I've got about all I eat is fruit and yogurt.
Okay. Right. Well, yes, it won't be hard for you to abstain from. Just have a little bit of unleavened bread. Just have a little.
So one thing I was curious about with the Seder, I don't know how we do it here, but at the congregation I go to in Houston, it's a long celebration. So I'm wondering how that lines up with the command to eat the Passover meal and haste.
Yes, the thing is, when do you have your first night Seder? This is an open question. When do you have your first night Seder? First night of? First night of unleavened bread, right? 15th of Nisan starts what we colloquially call Passover now. Passover, the actual day of Passover, is the 14th of Nisan.
Which
unleavened bread, sorry.
Next, is this like
Yeah, it's Sunday night and Monday.
Okay.
And then Monday night and Tuesday is the 15th of Nisan, which is the first day of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is the 7-day feast that we're commanded to eat matzah. We call the whole period of time now Passover, colloquially, just because we're lazy and it's easier to cover it all in one base than to use 16 syllables to say one thing. And so we call it all Passover today. The thing is you can't actually keep Passover the way the Bible, the reason we have a Passover Seder, because the Passover Seder is not how the Bible tells us to observe Passover. We can't keep Passover today the way the Bible prescribes it because there's no temple standing in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. We're actually commanded to take our offering to Jerusalem, have it slaughtered there, and then we sit there and eat it, or we bring it back if you live close to your home and you eat it, right? Once the temple was established in Jerusalem, Deuteronomy says once he has singled out a location, a city, that his name would be placed, that there is the only place we can make sacrifices anymore. We can't just do it haphazardly anywhere else anymore, right? So in the original Exodus, in Exodus 12, they actually slaughtered the lamb at their door, and then they put the blood upon it, they took it inside, they roasted it and ate it, the whole thing, right? And then as we move forward, they begin to bring their offering to the tabernacle for it to be slaughtered by the priests, and then they take it home and they eat it. And then as we move even forward and the temple is built, then we begin to bring our offering to the temple, and they slaughter it and roast it, and then we bring it home and eat it, or we eat it there. If you go to Tel Shiloh, which is the site that the tabernacle stood for 370 some odd years before Eli and his sons completely royally messed everything up and the ark was taken off by the Philistines. When you go to Tel Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle stood for just short of 400 years, you can look at the hills around it. They're still finding pottery buried in the hills, because what would happen is you would go to the temple on the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage feasts, which are Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. You would go to the tabernacle in Shiloh. You would bring your sacrifice. The sacrifice would be slaughtered and roasted. You would then take it to the hills overlooking the tabernacle, and you would actually eat your meal, your Passover meal or whatever else there. Shavuot, Sukkot, all of it would be eaten there on the hills. And the dishes that you're using are brand new dishes solely for holy purposes. Once you've eaten off of it, it is a holy dish. You don't take it home to eat unholy things with, or ordinary things, not necessarily unholy, but ordinary things with. So they would actually shatter the dishes right there on the hillside. Right? And that way those holy dishes wouldn't be used for ordinary things again. And then they would go home and they would use their ordinary dishes for ordinary food from then on. And so the way we celebrate Passover today with the Passover Seder is not the way the Bible prescribes for Passover to be celebrated, because we can't do it that way anymore. Instead, what we did, and this goes back to Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, which are pre-Yeshua, right? That's the guys like Daniel and Nehemiah and so on, that lived in there. It was about a 150, 200 year period of time that you had 70, the 70 leaders, Anshe Knesset Gedolah, that would help kind of decide how we were going to do things. And one of the questions that arose as we were rebuilding the temple after the Babylonian diaspora, one of the questions that arose was, listen, we got to understand, our people, we're really good people, like God loves us, but we're kind of dumb sometimes. We don't necessarily do what we're supposed to do, and that's why we lost the temple. Should we find ourselves in that boat again where the temple is gone, like, how do we maintain Judaism without the temple? And so from the Anshe Knesset Gedolah on, Judaism has worked to define itself. Should there be no temple, how do we continue to live it on? Right? How do we continue to live out the Bible in a literal sense without the temple standing, without the priesthood active? And so when it happened again, we were already ready. Like, it wasn't what we wanted, but we were already ready and started to migrate towards that synagogue structure, which synagogues were really established roughly during that time period and started to grow. And so we can't celebrate it the way we did before, but the Anshe Knesset Gedolah says, well, do we just not do it at all? Or do we find a way to adapt it so that we can do it commemorative of what it's supposed to be, but recognizing that we're not doing it the exact way the Bible calls? And so that's where the Passover Seder comes from. And it developed over the course of a couple of hundred years. What we have now developed over the course of a couple of hundred years. And there are aspects that have even been into probably the 1500s that were added into the Seder as things went on to kind of draw our attention back. But the reality is the Passover Seder can be held on the 15th of Nisan rather than the 14th of Nisan, because we're not actually able to make the sacrifice of the 14th of Nisan, right? And so we have the Passover Seder on the 15th of Nisan, recognizing we can't do what's prescribed on the 14th, so we don't do it on the 14th. We do it on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, on the 15th of Nisan, and that meal becomes our Erev Shabbat meal, but it's recognizing the reality of Pesach and what we're supposed to be doing, which is also why it's intriguing to see how much of the Passover Seder itself points directly to Yeshua, even though the people that developed the Passover Seder had zero belief that Yeshua was the Messiah. But there's so much in it that points directly to Yeshua as the Messiah. Right? And by the way, if you're like one of these people that's anti-Talmud and the rabbinic traditions and yada, 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 the entire Passover Seder is Talmudic rabbinic tradition. All of it. And why do we still interact with it? Well, because this is a continuity with Jewish history. If Messiah was walking on earth today in human form as he did in the first century, he would be having Passover Seders as we do today. Not saying this is the ideal way to do it. He would be pointing out the way we should be doing it while participating in it. How do we know that? Well, because he went to synagogues, and synagogue was a Pharisaic structure. Yeshua, for all intents and purposes, was a Pharisee, which also proves to us that he wasn't speaking against Pharisaism, but against a specific ruling class of the Pharisees, a specific group of individuals who were in the ruling class of the Pharisees. So, yes, that's how we end up doing that. It's not the exact same thing the Bible prescribes, because it's not on the day the Bible prescribes, because we can't actually do it the way the Bible prescribes. So our Passover Seder is commemorative of what the Bible prescribes, while recognizing we can't do it that way, which is precisely why most Ashkenazi Jews will not eat lamb ever on Passover, because we can't make the sacrifice for Passover, so they won't eat lamb as a reminder of we're not eating lamb because of how stupid we were.
Yeah, it allows. I'm sorry. No.
And then Sephardic Judaism almost always eats lamb as a reminder of what we should be doing, and if the temple was standing, we could be. And so you see that juxtaposition there. I like lamb, so in home Seder, I don't mind having lamb. It's enjoyable. It's one of my favorite proteins. And our congregational Seder, which will be on the 25th at the Civic Center, we don't offer lamb. We do beef or chicken, because if a non-believing Jewish person comes to the Seder, having lamb, especially if they're Ashkenazi, having lamb would be offensive. It would be problematic. It would be a hurdle they have to get over, and we're going to spend the entire night talking about Yeshua. That's a pretty big hurdle already. We don't need to add more to it. Does it make sense? Okay.
Yeah,
Did that answer your question for the most part? Cool.
Yeah, and I was just, what the Seder allows is for us to, and you're still fulfilling mitzvot that's in the Torah through the Seder. By the Lord said it should be a memorial, so you're remembering it, and you're also fulfilling the direct command of, when your children ask you, why do we do these things, you are to tell them, because the Lord with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. So it's a way for the Jewish community to do that as well. Does anybody have any other questions or comments before we share a few resources? No? Okay. So want to talk about having a Seder and some things that'll help you if you've never hosted one, or because traditionally in Passover you either host a Seder or you go to be a part of one, and we want to just talk about a few things, because just to go back and recap, I always do this, just the teacher and me. Review. We clear our house of chametz, symbolic of, but that is not just to get rid of the chametz, the leaven. It's also to inform our hearts that we need to remove sin, be in the continual process of removing sin from our life, right? Bringing us to a place of repentance. We talk about refraining from eating chametz during unleavened bread. We talked about also eating unleavened bread. And now we just want to talk a little bit about the Seder, some practical things. So generally a Seder, not going to go through the whole Seder, but generally one of the things is there's a Seder plate in the center of the table with various accoutrements on it. Always looking for a reason to use that word.
Accoutrements.
Various little things that... well, some of it is traditional. Some of it is commanded by God. Eat the lamb with bitter herbs. Those things are on there. But I remember our first Passover Seder we did at home, and you can have an intimate Passover Seder, or you can have a large one. And yes, to answer your question, they are traditionally supposed to be long. And I'll let David get into a little bit of that, because when I talk about streamlining something, David goes, it's supposed to be long. It's supposed to be long. Supposed to be long. I was like, come on. Because I'm going to a Seder, Brooke and I are going to a Seder, it's going to have almost 20 kids at it, and I said, okay, we're going to have to streamline, and David goes, it's supposed to be long. I'm like, well, you're not going to be there. The point is, we'll get there. So, they're supposed to be long, yes. And you're telling a story and things like that, but we didn't have any Judaica. None. My family didn't. And this is years before I met Brooke, but so my mom took a big plate and she put little bowls around it and we put stuff in it. Listen, don't let not having like Judaica or all these things, accoutrements again, keep you from doing something that's on your heart, because that's what God looks at, is the heart, right? But yes, there are some resources out there. We have some available, and Rabbi David's going to share some things, so I'm going to pass it over to him to talk about the Seder.
So first I want to recommend, and if you've been through our membership class, you already know about this book. If you've not, now you do. This book is called God's Appointed Times by Rabbi Barney Kasdan, who is a friend of ours. This book goes through all of the Moedim of Leviticus 23 in kind of a devotional style. It will give you the biblical background, the historical background, the traditional background. It will tell you how it's celebrated within traditional Judaism, as well as how it can be celebrated within a Messianic Jewish context. Gives you recipes. His Yom Kippur recipes are some of the best I've ever not had. That's a joke because Yom Kippur is a fast day, so you don't eat anything. There's no recipes for Yom Kippur. But there are recipes for everything else in there. But it's got a really great section on Pesach, on Passover, how to observe it, things that you can do, and so on. And then for a Passover Seder, you need a Haggadah, which is the telling. Very literally is what it translates to, but the telling. This is one that I really like called the Passover Trilogy Haggadah by another friend of mine, or a friend of ours, Rabbi Jen Rosenberg in New Jersey. It is a combination of a very traditional Passover Haggadah with a lot of insertion of the Messianic Jewish imagery that we find through it. And it's designed specifically to be used in a Messianic Jewish Seder where there might be non-believing Jewish family who come, because all of the Messianic adaptations are in special gray boxes, so that as you're going through it, because you're actually physically reading the Haggadah as you go through. Everybody at the table participates, you're reading through the Haggadah. And if you have your non-believing Jewish family there, or friends or whatever at your Seder, and you're working through it, they can skip over reading the gray boxes if they want to, and still have the normal Haggadah that they're participating, interacting with. But because you're going to be reading through it anyways, they're going to hear it even if they try to ignore it. So it's a great resource. But there's a ton of other Messianic Haggadot that are out there. There's a ton of traditional Haggadot. You can usually go to grocery stores this time of year and get the old-fashioned Maxwell House Haggadah, which is actually an Orthodox Haggadah. It's a phenomenal one. It is really long. It's in, what's that?
They're Ashkenazi.
Yeah, a lot of Ashkenazi Hebrew. But it's a great resource. I also have access to a digital Messianic Haggadah. It's a PDF of a Messianic Haggadah, not the same one, it's a different one, but it's very similar, which if you don't have access to a Haggadah and you would like that, let me know, and I can send you that link for that PDF Haggadah. But it is a great resource. But either way, if you want to celebrate Passover at home, and we do a big Passover Seder somewhere later in the week of Passover, so that our entire congregation and anybody from the outside that wants to come in can celebrate the events of the Seder together, can participate in the Seder as one together. But we strongly encourage, as always, on the first night or the second night or the second night in traditional Judaism outside of Israel. They'll do both nights, but especially on the first night of Passover, either have a Seder at home and invite your friends and family over to join with you, or try to invite yourself to somebody else in the congregation Seder at their home. Hopefully you're inviting people to your home for Seders, because there's a lot of people that maybe don't have access to something and don't want to do it by themselves but want to participate. So have a Seder at home, invite people to your home, or invite yourself to somebody else's home. We always get together every year with my parents and Danielle's parents, our siblings, in Pensacola for a Seder at my parents' home. So that's what we'll be doing first night. And it's convenient at their home because our living arrangement's a little weird right now, so we don't have a dining room to do it in. But nonetheless, and as Rabbi Toby was saying, you don't need all of the fancy stuff. Like, there are really nice fancy Passover Seder plates that have the space for everything and all this. You don't have to have that. Get a couple of small bowls, get a couple of coffee mugs for all I care, and you need 6 of them, lay them out, and the elements that are needed for the Seder, put them in those mugs, put them in those little bowls, and spread them around the table so that they're together and you can interact with it. If you don't have fancy Shabbat candlesticks, okay, great. Pull out some not fancy Shabbat candles. Pull out candlesticks. You traditionally need 2 of them. Put 2 candlesticks out so you can interact with that part. If you don't have a fancy Kiddush cup, okay, great. Get a regular wine glass. If you don't have a wine glass, go get a Dixie cup. I don't care. There are ways to do it where you can interact. It doesn't have to be all crazy ornate. As you get further into your walk in Messianic Judaism, you may want to go get the nicer Judaica and so on, and that's great. But you don't have to have all the things to do the things right? You can still do it right, even if you don't have all the things. Especially if you've never done it before, having that fancy plate's not going to matter to you because you're not really going to understand it yet. But as you work through it, I think as Rabbi Toby was saying, a lot of people will hold off on participating in stuff in the Messianic Jewish life because they don't have the resources, they don't know what they're doing, but we all got to start somewhere. As long as you do it with the right heart, in Hebrew we call kavanah, the right intention of the heart. As long as you do it with the right heart and you do it with the right kava, the right procedure, like you're following Haggadah and so on. And then beyond that, as long as you're trying reverently to do it, right? There are a lot of people that will go and make a big hoopla over doing a Passover Seder, but they're like, oh, I don't like that Orthodox Judaism does this. This is dumb, so we're not going to do that. We're going to do... Don't break it apart. Don't make it, like Rabbi Toby was talking about streamlining things. He's not talking about getting rid of the important stuff, just figuring out how to make it a little swifter, a little faster. I know a lot of Orthodox Seders will be 6+ hours, but it's not all because you're reading through the Haggadah. The Haggadah is long, right? There's always the fifth question nobody talks about, which comes up more often than anything, which is when are we going to eat? But the Orthodox Seder is not always long because of the Haggadah. It's long because of the joy and the worship that goes into it. And there are songs that are being sung, and people are smacking the table and up dancing and they go after it. They have a great time with it. They make the focus on their worship of the Lord, right? So it doesn't have to be crazy long. Our congregational Seder is usually like 2.5 hours. And that includes eating. Like, that's a full catered meal and everything, because again, we've figured out how to do everything, but also do it streamlined. And our home Seders are usually about 2.5 hours, and so on. They don't have to be uber long. They can be. It can be as long as you want to make it. But it is important that you try, if you're able to, that you try to interact with it. So we strongly encourage first night Seders. We even more strongly encourage you come and join the congregation for the congregational Seder so that we can all celebrate together as well.
Yeah, and the reason why we call this a synagogue, we also call it a shul, because Rabbi David and myself, my wife has been doing Messianic Judaism longer than I have. And Rabitz and Danny has been in Messianic Judaism. We are here to say, this is how you do this, right? What happened was I went to a few Shabbat dinners, and I loved it so much, I wanted to take ownership. And God was like, yes, that's what God wants. That's what God wants, is for you to take ownership of your walk with him. So I said, I want to have Shabbat dinner. And God's like, great. And then I went to enough Passover Seders, and I said, well, I want to have one. Mom, let's have one. Me, you, and my sister, And then, so, and don't feel like it has to. Come to the CMC to see a grander display and to be with the people that you love so much here. But I've been to very intimate ones and have watched people when it hits. There's something about the Passover story. When it hits, and I remember seeing a guy that I knew for years that, like, he was kind of this tough guy, and he just broke down crying reading the Haggadah because it hit him, that story of the light to the heavy of what God was teaching and what Yeshua did for us and what he did for him. And the reason why also we encourage the individual home intimate Passover Seders is because it's what God said, individual houses. And I'm telling you, God doesn't need a big production. God loves the intimacy. And I have felt the Spirit of God just as thick sitting at a dinner table with 3 or 4 people praising the Lord for his wonders as much as I've felt it in a place with a throng of people that love God, right? And that's all I got. Rabbi Dave, do you have anything else?
I think that's it for me.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up this evening? We always like to leave room for that.
Great. Well, I hope that means we did a good job explaining everything.
And if we didn't, we tried, and you didn't help us. No, I'm just joking.
David.
We love you guys. Yes? Yeah.
But I live with my son and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can only do what I can do.
Of course.
And so, I don't, like I said, I am having to do what I have to do, and they honor me eating. I have not ate anything that I wasn't supposed to eat.
Right.
Since
Yeah.
I said I wanted to become a member.
Wonderful.
And I've been reading the books, and the last one, I'm almost halfway.
Keep at it.
So,
Let us know if you have any questions. Love you,
That-
by the way.
Are you done?
Okay, so if that's it, we'll close out. We'll just pray us out. Father, again, Lord, we thank you for just giving us audience with you, Lord, as we talk about your word and the great things that you've done, and the great things that you're still doing, Lord. Pray that you would bless each of your people, Lord, and send them off. And I pray that this is just pray that their Passovers are just so meaningful. They're here because they want to know more, Father, and I pray that you would honor them by giving them wisdom and blessing them with your presence this past